this topic, I'm actually going to talk to you about what you need in order to be able to conduct a walkthrough or a usability test. To conduct a usability test or a walkthrough, planning is critical. Lots goes on in a usability test or a walkthrough, so you need to make sure you have the following. Obviously, you need to have your designs, either rough sketches or if you're doing a formal usability test, a working prototype. Obviously, you need a room to conduct the test in. It could be in someone's house, it could be in a cafe, or it could be in a formal usability lab. Obviously, you need the user. Without the user, there's no point doing any form of usability evaluation. Obviously, you need some scenarios or realistic tasks. The goal is you've got a realistic user in the room and you want them to do the common tasks that we perform when they're on your website. This is a nice to have, but you might want to have an observer, someone to help you and support in terms of taking notes. The more usability tests you do, the better skilled you become, and often this becomes a luxury that you don't need. And most important of all is the stakeholder. A lot of people think usability testing involves just the user and the facilitator. However, I often find if there's a stakeholder watching, often in a different room, it makes it a lot easier to actually talk through some of the findings and agree on the rationale in terms of improving the design. Let's talk about the facilitator. The facilitator is really key in terms of running a usability test or usability walkthrough. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of stories. Once I had a facilitator who was quite new to the process, a little bit nervous, hadn't conducted usability testing too often. And that really shows. So when the user comes in, they actually feel the nervousness in the room and they feel the tension. That already has a negative impact on the user. The whole idea is, as a facilitator, to make the user as comfortable as possible. One of the things I do is I often tell a few jokes and I talk about the user, talk about their life, talk about the day, where they've been, what they've been doing. And throughout that conversation, I'll throw in some formalities like, oh, can you sign this form while you're there? By the way, we're recording a session. I hope that's okay with you. Those sort of things. One of the other things that I like to do is make the user really feel comfortable in terms of providing criticism. One of the things that we often say is, hey user, I want you to tell me my baby's ugly. Now by baby, we're referring to the design. But the whole notion is, you want the user to feel comfortable giving feedback. You want to tell the user they're not being tested. It's the design that's being tested. And you want them to tell them, you are looking for criticism. The reason I find using that phrase, my baby's ugly, or tell me my baby's ugly, is great because it does a couple of things. It makes the user laugh, and it also tells them that you're really open to their feedback and you want them to give you constructive feedback about the design. Remember, you don't own the design, and that's something else you also want to tell the user. And in previous modules, I talked about scenarios. And we've also talked about the notion that usability walkthroughs are quite informal, so therefore you walk the user through the design. Whereas with usability testing, you need realistic scenarios and tasks for the user to perform. So I'm going to talk about the sort of things you need to make sure you have in your scenarios. So some of the things you need to include in your scenario are these, and I'm going to talk about them one by one. Let's use a realistic person, a persona called Jane. So the whole idea is to bring Jane to life. So a scenario is a day in the life of Jane. The purpose being to allow the user to be able to understand Jane, and when they're looking at your designs, to be able to perform the tasks that Jane would perform. So one of the things would be, for example, Jane is looking to transfer some money and she wants to use online banking. Okay. So her motivation, the reason she needs to do it is because it was payday yesterday and she wants to put money into her loan account. You want to make the scenario as realistic as possible so people can affiliate with that scenario. At the same time, scenarios are story-based, so it's not a bunch of bullet points. You're actually writing a story about Jane and you're getting the user to read through it. Obviously, within the scenario, you need to actually include some tasks. For example, Jane needs to transfer some money, or Jane needs to do X, Y, or Z using the website. The whole idea is that once the user has read through the scenario, they need to actually complete a task. It's really important that in your scenarios you don't talk about the system or features of the system. For example, you don't want to say, oh, Jane needs to log in to the system, or Jane needs to use feature X of the system. The whole idea is to keep it as generic as possible, allowing the user to make sense of the story themselves and see if they can use the design. Also, language is very key. You don't know what type of users you will have in terms of their strength in speaking English. So you need to make sure the language is very simple and at the same time, generic enough that every user who's going to come into your usability test can affiliate with the scenario, understand it, and know the tasks they need to perform. There are two other points I want to clarify with you and talk about in regards to usability testing. Data and location. This can be important. So think about it. Usability testing is scientific. It's about capturing the data, how long the user takes to complete a task, the length of time they take to complete a task. So you want to actually capture this data. And the more you capture, the better it is. So if you have the ability to be able to have additional note takers, it's going to help you to capture more information. And the second one is location. End of the day, you're testing the user in supposedly a realistic environment. So you might want to actually meet a user at a cafe local to their house, at a library, or perhaps even at the workplace. But consider this, if you're doing back-to-back usability testing, there will be logistical problems. So what typical design agencies that conduct usability testing do, they have a dedicated room within their office, often they call it a usability lab, where they recruit and actually invite the users to come into that room. That allows you to repeat the usability testing one after the other without having to worry about moving your equipment somewhere else. So in this topic, I've talked about what you need before you conduct a usability test. We've talked about data, location, the user, scenarios, facilitator, the room itself. These are the sort of things you need to be aware of. And as I mentioned before, planning is critical. In the next topic, I'll actually run you through a typical usability testing session.